It's Dr. Neal Milner, and thank you for coming today to talk about politics in Hawaii.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get involved with this, analyzing politics?
Well, I've taught political science for a long period of time, but I didn't really specialize in these kinds of things in campaigns and elections. And I sort of stumbled into it, getting reacquainted with it. I had done some political work before, but not for many years. I got reacquainted with it when I started doing some work for KITV just as a kind of analyst. And one day they had me for an interview, and they said it was a presidential election, and they said, well, why don't you just stay here? And so I ended up talking and being at the anchor desk for about 3 hours, and that was really the start of it. And then after that, I just got more interested, did more work, and people call. And so the last course that I taught at UH was an undergraduate course in campaigns and elections. So that's how I got into it.
So one of the hot topics right now is Governor Neal Abercrombie's reaction to the Pro Bowl, and the Pro Bowl getting subsidized for $4 million. Tell us a little bit about that and what you think of that whole issue.
Well, let's start with the big picture first. This is not just about the Governor Abercrombie getting angry at the NFL or not liking football. The bigger thing is that this is part of a dynamic that's clear all across the country when it comes to the budget crisis that so many states face, and that is that they have to constantly think about making short-term cuts, even though they may have long-term consequences that are really more costly than if you spent the money right away. So I think what the governor is doing here is reacting by saying, here's another example of we're giving money here when we could be giving money somewhere else. It isn't so much whether that's a measured response or not a measured response. It's about the fact that so much of our cuts and so much of our complaints about cuts are people saying, you know what, we could use that money in ways that are better. So I think that that's what it's about. I don't think he's got anything particularly against the National Football League. And I think he's the one in the past who's actually talked about bringing a pro team to Honolulu. Now there's a stretch, a pro football team. So I think it was mainly about the same sort of thing that he reacted to in regard to the AARP and pension things. He looks at these organizations. He says they're big, they're rich, and they're selfish. Everybody's got to stop doing that, and I think that was what was going on.
But it got such a reaction. What do you think about the reaction? It went national.
Well, it goes national because you're taking on, first of all, the NFL, it's very visible right now because it's millionaires versus billionaires in the collective bargaining or the non-collective bargaining process that's actually going on. And then he got some publicity from Rush Limbaugh. My guess is that public opinion, at least if you look on the sports blogs, is probably against Abercrombie. And I don't think that that's such a big deal about it. But it's not surprising that it goes national because this is a national game. The Pro Bowl is something that's fairly visible.
And this is kind of how he is anyway. He doesn't mind taking on big issues, right?
No, I don't think he minds taking on big issues. And he is very pointed in the way he talks. And notice I didn't say angry. He's very pointed. He uses language that he's thought about, and he's come up very clear. He calls the NFL a tremendously rich, selfish organization. He called the AARP an insurance company. So he has these kinds of metaphors that he uses to get his point across.
So what else is coming up in 2012? We have some big elections coming up. What do you think about that?
Well, the big elections are coming up, particularly for Senator Akaka's seat. And there's started a lot of jockeying going on, especially in the Democratic Party. In the Republican Party, the question really seems to be whether Linda Lingle will run. And I imagine that she's not being coy here, that there's some fairly significant reasons why she wouldn't want to take this on. Among the Democrats, I think what's really interesting is how Mazie Hirono really does emerge as a very strong candidate right off the bat, and that's because she's not carrying any of the baggage that Ed Case is carrying or that Mufi is carrying. And what I mean by that is this is not about right now who's going to win in the November election, the final election. This is about who's going to win the primary, and so you have to appeal to your voters in the primary. The left of the party has never liked or trusted Ed Case. A lot of the regulars didn't like him because he ran against Senator Akaka. Mufi just came off a terrible defeat in which he alienated a whole lot of and disappointed a whole lot of people. So Mazie comes across as fairly strong because she doesn't have a great reputation as a legislator, but she hasn't done anything that's really going to visibly get her in trouble. She's fairly popular on the left, so she's a fairly, I think, a fairly significant candidate. Right now, it's all about who can raise the money. It's all about deciding whether to go in, and people in Hawaii tend to decide pretty early whether they're going to run or not. We seldom see a candidate who emerges at the end as being a kind of non-political candidate. And again, going back to Linda Lingle, she's undoubtedly the strongest Republican candidate, but she also carries, well, one of the bags she carries is that she's a Republican. In this state, Republicans start with a handicap, a historical, it's not about competence. They start with a historical handicap that this is a Democratic state, it's highly Democratic, it's solidly Democratic. She was able to win for governor, but she also lost her first shot at governor that she probably could have won. So she's looking at these kinds of things. I also don't know much about how much she wants to get back into politics. One level, she's a pretty private person.
She also looks pretty happy at the gym when I see her there. She's tan and she's skinny and she's happy. So.
Oh, she is? Yeah. I haven't seen her out. Hawaii Kai is becoming a place where lots of people who have run for office, some successfully and unsuccessfully, are living.
That's true. And what about in terms of in Congress with the replacing Mazie Hirono in that position?
Well, that's an interesting situation. I think that you had a fairly good pool. Let's start with the Democrats. You had a fairly good pool who ran when the Ed Case's seat opened up. Those folks came out pretty well. You may find some of those. You may find Brian Schatz. This depends what he wants to do. Gary Hoser, I think, is another one. I think that Tuli Gabbard entering the race is fairly significant. She's got a good background to run. If she's like her father, and her father is a very good campaigner, whatever you think about him on other things, he's a very personable, very good campaigner. I think that adds a kind of spice to the mix. That's a solid Democratic seat. Even after reapportionment, I can't imagine. I know that Dylan Naka has some ideas about how it might become more Republican, but man, it's a hard one. So who would emerge there is another kind of question. So right now it is fairly early to see that, and you may see some other candidates jump in there. Schatz is in an interesting situation because he might decide, this is not based on inside information, that rather than do the normal Democratic thing, which is to wait in line and then to kind of get coronated as the governor, he may decide he wanted to go to Congress or also take a shot or go into the House of Representatives. He may decide to take a shot for the Senate seat. The more Democratic candidates that enter, the better a guy like Schatz has of maybe pulling it off in the primary.
So what about the legislature and the governor? They seem to have this, even though they're Democrats on both sides, they seem to have this animosity or at least feisty fighting going on.
Well, I don't know how much of it is animosity. There's been cases in the past where there are clear policy differences, in what they want to do in regard to raising revenue and in regard to cutting. And that doesn't seem to be in any position right now where it's going to go away. Now, Calvin Say has now started to talk about a way, if we can get this pension reform thing or the pension taxation in a more refined way, maybe we can deal with it. But I think that's the significant difference. And people have to learn another lesson from this. When Linda Lingle was the governor, it was a little bit more about animosity, but it was certainly more about differences in the party. Now you have a governor who was very popular with the legislature, still is in a kind of political way, knows how to talk to people, knows how to convince people. You have a solid Democratic, how much more solid can it get? And you still can't get your policies across because there's very significant disagreements on very important issues. And I don't think that's going to go away so easily. That's not just, if it were just about animosity, politicians can get over animosity because most of the time they're angry at somebody and you just got to learn to do business. This is about some significant policy differences.
So what do you think the biggest issue is going to be in 2012? The president's election, whether President Obama or the Senate or the House or the legislature? What do you think is going to be the biggest
You mean in Hawaii? Mm-hmm. Well, the presidential election here is generally on, let's not say the back burner, but not too far close to the front burner because, again, most of the time the political parties don't put much money into the state because it's so solidly Democratic. Let's put it this way. If the Democrats have to the National Democrats have to put a lot of money in to make sure Obama wins Hawaii, then they're in trouble. And the Republicans may have a better place to use their money anyway. So I think that the issues here are probably going to be the same issues that they are anywhere else, which is jobs and the economy. They just play out somewhat differently here. There isn't the same kind of passion on the right that's able to mobilize, whether it's social conservatives or whether it's the Tea Party, and there's obviously some overlap. So you don't have the kind of anger and the kind of rebelliousness. The Republicans certainly have a little bit of that, but not enough to really, at least up to now, to really color significantly the Republican response to things. So I think the issues are going to likely be the same thing. I think and I think the same thing is true for Congress. You know, you go back and look at the Dejoux campaign. Dejoux ran a classic, consistent, politically conservative race at a time when the Democrat was more likely to be vulnerable than anybody else, and he lost. So that the Republicans really have a problem here to try to figure out what it is they do. I know lots of Republicans say it's about branding and all that. They really have to figure out how to make these kinds of issues work here, and I think that's going to be a dynamic that carries over also.
So the final question is, what about polls? Do people believe any polls that come out?
Well, they should, but with certain kind of provisos. You don't pay much attention to polls now. If you're a candidate, you pay attention to polls now that you're privately commissioning, probably, or maybe otherwise, to see your favorability ratings and your visibility ratings. That's when, if you go back to the old Peter Carlisle days, when Peter Carlisle had a favorability rating of about 150%, he was like a 10. If a 10 is beautiful, he was like a 10 in terms of that. That's important. The rest of it is very much in flux. And you can see that nationally also. So you don't pay all that much attention, and you never pay attention to one single poll anyway. If you want to get some kind of idea of trending, some kind of idea of things that are happening, then over time they're better. But our polls here have a history of being a little bit odd. In the last elections, Civil Beat, the pollster that Civil Beat had was fairly accurate. But the idea that somehow you can intuit from talking to a cab driver in Chinatown the basic political dynamic better than you can by systematically sampling a group of people doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Any final thoughts?
No, I think it's going to be an interesting political year. I think that I'm still old school. I still get more than slightly depressed when the day after one presidential campaign, the next one starts. Now, it's always been that way to some extent, but you never had a 24/7 media thing going. So I don't have a lot of, it's hard to get excited about that process right now.
All right, well, we'll have to have you on again when we get a little closer. Thank
Sure.
you so much for coming today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.